Do you photograph landscape and wildlife or other action activities such as sports? Do you find yourself having to switch your camera settings quickly to adapt to these different shooting scenarios? Also, did you know that there's a way to program these different scenarios into your camera and recall them quickly? Let me show you how to do this on your camera and how I have mine set up for my different scenarios. It's as easy as 1, 2, 3. Hello, I'm John Robertson. Welcome back to the channel. I photograph landscape and wildlife, which have completely different camera settings. I also record video of wildlife, which again has a different set of camera settings. Often I want to be able to quickly change my settings between landscape and wildlife, or from wildlife photography to wildlife video. All at the same time, I want to retain my default settings for landscape. Anytime that I talk about gear on my channel, you'll likely hear me say that the camera is really just a tool for photography. It should be set up to make it easier for you to get the photograph that you want. Using memory settings in your camera and being able to recall them quickly does just that. In fact, anytime you have different scenarios that require vastly different camera settings and you want to be able to switch between them quickly, memory settings and being able to recall them are a major factor in improving your photography workflow. If you only shoot landscapes or only portraits, you may also find that having different settings programmed into your memory to be able to recall quickly will also be beneficial. But be careful, again, the camera is just a tool to make your workflow easier, so don't overcomplicate it and make another switch setting that just takes away from your photography. For most modern cameras, there's a capability to create your different user settings and store them into a memory location for easy recall. Each manufacturer may have a different method to do that, and the way that you set them up and recall them may be different. However, this is not meant to be a camera comparison for how to do this from one manufacturer to another. On my Sony A1, and I think most of the Sony Alpha cameras, there is a mode dial that has modes 1, 2, and 3 that can be programmed and then used to recall the settings for those different scenarios. I believe Canon has a similar setup, and I believe Nikon has user 1, user 2, perhaps user 3 settings as well for this purpose. The fundamentals will be similar among the different manufacturers. You simply select the settings that you want for a different scenario, and then you program that memory setting for each scenario that you want to program, and then be able to recall them when you want to use that scenario. Then once you have recalled those default settings, you can adjust them as normally to dial in for the current conditions that you're in. For my workflow, I set up M3 as my landscape settings. I select M2 for my wildlife settings, and I select M1 for my wildlife video settings. The reason I use M2 for wildlife is because it is directly next to M3, and it's a single click or rotation of the mode dial to get from M3 to M2 for the situations that I'm shooting landscape and I want to quickly get to wildlife settings. Then I select my M1 dial for wildlife video, since it's also just a single rotation away from the M2. So as I'm photographing wildlife and I want to get a quick video, I can simply rotate the dial one more click away to get to the video setting. And then the converse is true as well. If I'm shooting the video, then I only need to make one rotation to get the switch back to M2 to continue to take photographs of the wildlife. I should note that when I'm out for a hike, say I'm hiking to a landscape location, I typically carry my camera on a camera clip on the outside of my backpack, and it is set to wildlife settings. So in case there is a sudden wildlife encounter, then I can quickly grab my camera, turn it on. I'm already set to wildlife default settings and get that photograph. Then once I get to my landscape location, simply rotate the dial to my landscape setting, M3 in this case, and I have my defaults ready to go for landscape. So let's talk a few examples of the camera settings that I may want to be different for my different scenarios. ISO, for example, for landscape photography, typically will have that set to my base ISO, which is 100 for Sony. For wildlife photography, I will use an auto ISO and have that programmed in for my default wildlife photography settings. For aperture, for landscape, may have that set at a baseline. I believe I have it set at f10 right now. For wildlife settings, I'll typically have that programmed at wide open, maybe a stop off. Currently, I have it set at wide open as my default setting. Shutter speed. For landscapes, I typically have that set at, 1/100. I believe I have that set up right now. It's just a default. And then for wildlife settings, I will have that set up for fast encounters that I may have. So I think I currently have that set up for 1/2500. Then you may have other settings that you'll want to program in for default as well for the different scenarios. For example, my focus point for landscape is currently set to a spot focus, and for wildlife, I'll have a larger area focus and set that on tracking. Of course, once you recall your default settings, you can change them as desired for the current conditions that you're shooting in. The beauty of it is you have the default settings, and once you recall that, you've got a very good starting point, and sometimes to the settings that you will need for the scenario that you're encountering at that time. So to program your settings for your different scenario, here's a simple example. You'll want to start in the exposure mode that you want to record for that scenario. For me, for landscape and for wildlife, I shoot in full manual, other than the difference being, as I mentioned before, for wildlife, I use auto ISO. Then select the other settings that you want to use as default for that scenario, such as your default shutter speed, your default ISO, as I stated before, your default aperture, as I stated before as well. There may be other things that you want to set, as I mentioned before as well, such as your focus area, perhaps your zebra settings. I typically don't default to zebra on for my wildlife settings, though I do default to it on for my landscape settings. Perhaps focus peaking you want on for one and not the other, etc. So you make all of those selections that you want for that scenario, then you program that into the memory setting for the decided scenario that you have. So once you make all of your settings for the scenario, then you program it into the memory location that represents that scenario. If you want to see the specific settings I use for all of my scenarios, leave a comment below and I'll provide that information. As I mentioned before, you can modify your settings after you've done your memory recall. So let's say I switch to memory 2, which is wildlife photography in my scenario. I can modify the shutter speed as I desire for the given conditions or given circumstances that I'm in. One thing that could be different among the different manufacturers that I'm not completely sure of is what happens when you power off the camera in those conditions. So for a Sony, once I've recalled, made modifications, power off, and I return without modifying the memory location again, I haven't recalled anything else, it will retain the changes that I've made. So for example, if I've executed a memory recall for wildlife, which is M2 in my condition, and my default shutter speed was set to 1/2000, and I lower my shutter speed because, let's say I've got a perch bird, and I drop it down to 1/800. Then I power my camera off. When I power my camera back on, if I've made no other changes, my shutter speed will retain the 1/800. Now, if I execute a recall back to M2 and recall that from memory, it will then go back to the default condition. I believe other cameras handle this separately, but I can't confirm that. So for my workflow, I like this operation just fine. Because if I've recalled a memory setting and then I modify one of those settings, shutter speed in this example, and then I turn off my camera, when I turn it back on, I want it to retain what I have just set previously because I'm likely shooting in the same conditions. If I was shooting a perch bird before and I turned off the camera to save battery, turned it back on, I'm probably shooting a perched bird again. So I don't want the camera deciding what's best for me. I, as the user, want to make that decision of what's best for me. If I want to recall back to the default, it's simply a click of the button, back out of M2, back to M2, and then I have returned to my default settings for that program memory location. So for my workflow, using memory settings is very powerful. It allows me to quickly select the settings that I want for different scenarios that may occur very quickly. Again, if I'm shooting landscape photos and I want to quickly get to my wildlife photo settings, I simply dial the switch from M3 to M2. Now I've got my default settings ready for wildlife. And even probably more useful when I go from M2 to M1 to go from my wildlife photography to wildlife videos. It's a simple switch, simple rotation of the dial, and I can go back and forth between those two without having to dial everything back in. Also for landscape then, I've got my default settings set up in landscape, so I can always return to that dial position, M3 in my case, and I'm ready to shoot landscapes. And then over time, you can modify those settings as you desire. You can always return to that setting. Let's say again for landscapes, it's M3, and you want to make some modification. You can simply recall it, modify it, reprogram that back into that memory location for recall later. Thanks for joining. Hopefully you found this informative. If you could, please like, subscribe, leave a comment below, and like it's time for me, let's get out.